Good evening, and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talk series. I'm Sheffield Hale, President and CEO of the Atlanta History Center. It's my honor to welcome you all here tonight virtually for our program with Andrew Feiler and former Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. Tonight, they are discussing Andrew's book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. I encourage you to purchase this book from our official bookseller, Acapella Books, located right here in Atlanta. There's a link to do that in your chat, and you'll also get that information in a follow-up email. And now I'll briefly introduce tonight's speakers, and it'll be very brief because we have a huge crowd tonight to kick off Andrew's book. And Andrew, who is a fifth-generation Georgian, he grew up Jewish in Savannah and has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South and by being a minority in the South. He also went to all the best schools and apparently seemed to get out of the South as quick as he could, but thankfully he's come back. And he's had a long and active civic life, serving on nonprofit boards, advising elected officials, and creating community initiatives. His photography is beautiful, and this book is no exception. His school images, Rosenwald School images, have received a number of pre-publication honors. The solo exhibition of this work will premiere downtown at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, beginning on May 22nd, 2021. His photographs have been featured in numerous publications and displayed in solo exhibitions around the country. His work is in public and private collections, including that of Atlanta University Center and Emory University. He will be in conversation with former Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. And Mayor Franklin was elected the 58th mayor of Atlanta from 2000 to 2010. And while there are a lot of people today that talk about infrastructure, Mayor Franklin did infrastructure and shows you the power of what you can do when you're a mayor or governor of a city or governor of a state, get things done. She did it, and we are so grateful today to have that infrastructure in place. We're honored to have both of her and Andrew here tonight, and I will now turn it over to Andrew to begin the conversation, and then Mayor Franklin will join him with questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Sheffield. Sheffield and I have been friends for a long time, and he has been a wonderful supporter of my photography for a very long time. And I just also have to add, he has done an extraordinary job of building the Atlanta History Center and turning it into one of the great cultural pillars of our region. And for that, we're all grateful, Sheffield, and we look forward to your continued service. And I also just want to acknowledge Shirley Franklin. When Shirley Franklin ran for mayor, she told everybody that if you elect me mayor, I will make you proud. And for 8 years, she made us very proud. And she continues to make us proud in all of the ways that she continues to serve our community, especially as chair of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. So it's an honor to share this stage with Shirley. It has been, today is pub date. And as I commented earlier this morning, there are authors who have published a lot of books who would aspire to the karma of having their pub date be opening day of the baseball season. But the karma has smiled upon us, and today the confluence rises. But it has been an amazing couple of weeks leading up to this book launch. So first of all, thank you all for joining us. The Atlanta History Center is the premier venue for nonfiction authors in our region. And we have shattered the record. We have 500 people signed up for this gathering tonight. So I appreciate every one of you joining us. Even in advance of today's pub date, this book has gone into a second printing, and you will see pieces coming in Smithsonian Magazine, Wall Street Journal Weekend, Architect Magazine, Preservation Magazine. Just this week, I got the first inquiry from a museum inquiring about adding this work to their permanent collection. And just yesterday, the first print of this work was purchased by a collector who lives in a town with a Rosenwald School that is in my book. So it has, it's been quite a run, and I appreciate everybody sharing tonight's celebration. The Rosenwald Schools program was one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. And yet it remains, it transforms this nation. It transforms the African-American experience, but it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep are largely unknown. My slides are, there we go. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in Bartow County in North Georgia. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany and settled in Springfield, Illinois. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln, who was resident in Springfield at that time. And he rises to become this president of Sears, Roebuck Company. He leads Sears from 1908 until his death in 1932, and he turns Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. He becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history, and his cause is what would later become known as civil rights. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, becomes an educator, becomes one of the most prominent voices in African-American voices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries America, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama known as Tuskegee Institute. And this photograph, this portrait of him hangs in the president's house at Tuskegee. Now, the two men meet in 1911. This is one of the rare photographs of them together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt that hangs, that was created to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove Rosenwald School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. So the two men meet in 1911. You have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration, which starts later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. But public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a small fraction of the funding provided to the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, these two men, forming the first major collaboration between Jews and African Americans, create a program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And they reach out to the Black communities of the South. And they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, and labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because and get the white school board to agree to, at a minimum, own, maintain, and staff these schools, pay for the teachers, because these will be public schools, and because we want to deliberately create Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress. If you do those things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And from 1912, when the community of Locha Pocos first starts to raise funds for what becomes the first Rosenwald School in Lee County, Alabama, 1912 to 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt, as president, dedicates the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. From 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And this program transforms America. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. What their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. that gap narrows precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald Schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Mississippi Field Secretary of the NAACP, who was later murdered for his activism, went to a Rosenwald school. Maya Angelou, who followed Bayard Rustin as the northern coordinator for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference out of New York, writes of her experience in an Arkansas Rosenwald school in her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And Congressman John Lewis went to an Alabama Rosenwald school, and he writes a glorious introduction to this book in which he describes his very first day in that school and other experiences in his education in a Rosenwald school. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools until early in 2015. I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac. Jeannie originated the role of African American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And I was shocked. I'm a fifth generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. How could I have never heard of this program? The pillars of this program, Jewish, Southern, progressive, activist, are the pillars of my life. And I was stunned that I had not heard of this program. So I came home and I Googled Rosenwald Schools. And what I found is that there were a number of books on this topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I decided to do exactly that. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 remain. Only about half of those have been restored. And over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 program states and shot 105 of the surviving 500 schools. This is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, built around 1915 from one of the original designs. It is one of the few remaining examples of one of the original designs of the Rosenwald Schools that survives. And it is what is known as a one-teacher school. This is the inside of that school. So as I traveled across these schools, I found schools like this, a number of different designs for a one-teacher school. Two-teacher schools. This is the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Three-teacher schools, the Pleasant Plains School in northeastern North Carolina. Notice these were all white clapboard buildings. So you have one-teacher schools, two-teacher schools, three-teacher schools. By the end of the program, they're building 1-, 2-, and 3-story brick buildings. Now, of the surviving 500 schools, very few are still in use for educational purposes. In fact, of the 105 that I visited, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. This is one of them. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, Little Rock. This school alone has a storied history, for it is several students from Dunbar who were among the Little Rock Nine who walked into history as they integrated Little Rock Central High. And if this architecture looks somewhat familiar with its Art Deco detailing, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central is the same architect as of the Dunbar School. It is today a magnet middle school. But many schools to survive have gone through the process of adaptive reuse. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters. This is the Pleasant Hill Rosenwald School in Cass County, Texas. And the quilters sold quilts to raise money to restore the Pleasant Hill Rosenwald School, to turn it into the community center that it is today. And the women gather on most Mondays to quilt in the Rosenwald School. Other schools have been turned into church halls. This is the Denby School in near Norfolk, Virginia. The Warfield, some schools are museums. This is the Warfield School in Tennessee. But other schools are yet to be restored and are at risk of collapse. This is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina. And indeed, there were times on this journey where I came across schools that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. The W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County was in fact demolished exactly 1 week before I arrived because it was deemed too unstable. And so therein lies the plea for preservation in this work, because these schools are the locus of memory and history and story, and it's essential that we try to preserve these perishable historic resources. The emotional heart of this narrative was the people that I met along the way. I met former students like Frank Brinkley and his brother, Charles Brinkley Sr. Notice the photograph above them on the wall of Julius Rosenwald. A number of Rosenwald schools had the portrait of Julius Rosenwald on the wall. This is the only one that I came across that has the original portrait. This portrait hung in this school when it opened, the Cairo School in Sumner County, Tennessee, when it opened in 1923. Now, Frank Brinkley and Charles Brinkley go to this school. Their dad is the principal and the one teacher. This is a one-teacher school. They both go to college. They both go to grad school. In fact, Frank goes to grad school twice, including getting a degree from Tuskegee. Frank goes on to become a high school science and math teacher. Charles goes on to become a middle school principal. They had 4 sisters, all of whom also went to this school, all of whom went to college, and the 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. It speaks to the multi-generational impact of this incredible program. I also met former teachers. This is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer's husband was Vernon Damer, the head of the NAACP in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Forest County, who was murdered for his activism. This school, the Bay Springs School, was built on 2 acres of land donated by Vernon Damer's grandfather. Vernon Damer was a student here. And when the school closed in 1958, it reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a community center and a locus of civil rights activity. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer drove people into Hattiesburg to register them, to attempt to register them to vote, he had them parked behind the school so that they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. Ellie Damer also went to a Rosenwald school. She went to college, and she came back and was a teacher in this very school. She had a long career as a teacher in the public schools in Mississippi, and recently their son Dennis has restored the school and brought it back to its stature as a community center. I'm going to end on the story of the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas, in the midst of, at the final stages of undergoing a renovation. The portrait the photograph in the center of this image dates from the 19th century. It is Sophia and Martin McDonald, both of whom were born into slavery. Upon emancipation, Martin McDonald begins to raise farm animals. He acquires some land. He acquires some more land. He eventually amasses 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald School program comes to Bastrop County in 1919, the family donates 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher, it's a one-teacher school, is Sophia and Martin's daughter. One of her students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this beautiful portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, also went to a Rosenwald school, a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They go off to college, they come back, they have a career as educators in Bastrop County, and they are now leading the restoration of the school. Students becoming teachers, becoming preservationists, and the keeper of the flame of history and memory. I came across that story time and again. And it's what moved me to end up making this body of work, not just images, but stories. I've written a short story that goes with every photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs, because I kept coming across these extraordinary stories. I found Rosenwalds that are connected directly to the Trail of Tears, the Great Migration, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Brown versus Board of Education, murder, embezzlement, and more. And so as you spend time with this book, I hope you'll spend time with the images, but I hope you'll also read the stories, because I think you'll be inspired, I think you'll be moved, and I think you'll come away a little bit more optimistic for the prospect of positive change in America. So I want to close with some reflections about the title of this work, A Better Life for Their Children. Booker T. Washington was seeking a better life for his children. Julius Rosenwald was seeking a better life for his children. The African-American families who were being taxed to pay for white schools and who still dug deep to help make possible the Rosenwald Schools, they were seeking a better life for their children. And collectively, they changed this nation, they changed the world. And I think the heart of this story speaks to everybody marching in the streets today for social change and social justice. Individual actions matter, and we can, in fact, change the world. Congressman John Lewis says writes in his beautiful introduction to this book that each of us have an obligation, a mandate, and a mission, that when we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I will close with a repetition of Congressman Lewis's most fervent call. May we all find paths to the making of good trouble. Thank you very much.
Andrew, that is
Shirley.
wonderful. How are you?
Great, thank you for joining us. It's an honor to share the stage with you.
No, it is my pleasure. And it's my pleasure to hear you speak about this project. And you've talked a little bit about the origin of the title for the project. Can you give us a little more color around that?
Yeah, so Louisiana had 395 Rosenwald schools, but it has some of except for Missouri, which only had 3 and has 1 left. Louisiana has fewer Rosenwald schools left than any other state. When I started this project, there were actually only 2 that were known, and it became 3. And now we think there's I think about somewhere between 5 and 8 have been identified. So I went to, and Louisiana is the Plaisance School, now Plaisance Elementary, is one of the very few Rosenwald schools that is still in use in education purposes. And I had been to that school earlier, and it's actually very difficult to shoot that school. And so I decided to go back, and I had this idea. I would go early in the morning and try to do this photograph as the school buses pulled up, with this sort of blurry school bus thing. It actually didn't really work very well, but that was that was kind of the idea. But because I'm going to be out in front taking pictures of the school buses pulled up, I figure I better call the principal and tell her that I'm coming. And so I go, and I'm sitting there, and the buses are coming in, and I end up taking my picture. And then before I'm done, I go in to then introduce myself to the principal. And it turns out she knows a lot about Rosenwald schools. And this is a Rosenwald school from early in the program that demonstrates the incredible commitment of the African-American community. 70% of the money of this school is raised by the local Black community. And she marvels at this. And she said they worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because education in their eyes was truly liberation. And that's where the title of this book comes from.
Well, I didn't know that story. I've read through much of the book, but I did not know that story, A Better Life for Their Children. Well, indeed, that is what you have demonstrated by telling the history of the Rosenwald schools. I'm curious about the photograph on the cover of the book. Where is that, and why that photograph?
So the that is in the so I showed early on the quilt that was made to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. That's Columbia. And that quilt hangs in that school. And that image on the cover, if you actually look on the far left corner, is the quilt hanging in that school. So that was a 2-teacher school. And one of the rooms has been set up as this restored classroom. And the other is kind of an event space. It's an open space. And, there's essentially 3 types of images in this work. There's the exterior images that kind of tell the architectural narrative. There's the interiors that tell the adaptive reuse narrative, and there's the portraits. And I thought that this classroom being restored was the hallmark of what this story is about, which is that those classrooms held the hopes and dreams of these communities. And I thought that restoration, with some of its details, the globe, the flag, the books that are sitting out on some of the school desks, speak to the heart of what these spaces were to these communities.
It also is a very peaceful picture.
Yes.
I mean, at the time of building of the Rosenwald schools, not all of these communities were peaceful all the time. There was a lot of tension.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that characterizes the Rosenwald Schools program is that they had some design specifications, which is essentially that the schools were supposed to be modest. Now, modesty was in part to save cost, but it was also in part not to attract the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the white citizenry. And indeed, there are a number of schools which do burn.
My. So how did you develop your approach for telling this story visually?
So, I knew this was an amazing story, but how do you tell it visually? And it was not really clear from the beginning. Well, my process is to read and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. And early on in my reading, I came across this extraordinary story. The Rosenwald Schools program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team could keep an eye on them. And Washington has these photographs made of the students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools. Earlier tonight, I showed one of those photographs from the Jefferson Jacobs School in Jefferson County, Kentucky. And he sends these photographs of these students and teachers proudly standing in front of the school, representing the dreams of their community. And Rosenwald looks at these photographs and he writes back to Washington that he is so moved to see these pictures that he is going to expand the program. And these photographs continue to be taken throughout the program, and they represent this visual language. And so in recognition of that, I decided to make this entire body of work black and white and horizontal, because that was in recognition and homage to this visual pillar of the story. So that was part of the answer to your question. The second part of the answer to your question is I started out shooting exteriors, and I would go around to these different schools, but it became very clear that that was an incomplete version of the story. So I started venturing into the schools, which of course meant more research because I had to get permission to get into the schools. And that's when I stumbled on the adaptive reuse narrative. And then I started to meet more of the people. And that's when I realized that they were this essential part of this story. And so it becomes this mix between the architectural narrative, the adaptive reuse narrative, and the personal narrative woven together.
That sounds pretty exciting. I mean, was that over a period of months, years?
3.5 years.
Over the period of 3.5 years, and it evolved over that period of time.
Yes, it took that long.
Well, we are the beneficiaries of it taking a long time, because this is a wonderful way to tell the story, and to make the story accessible to people on various levels. And how do you describe your voice as an artist?
So, I've been a serious photographer most of my life, but about 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously. But as you well know, Shirley, I have been a progressive activist my whole life. I've been deeply involved in the not-for-profit world of Atlanta, the public policy world of Atlanta. And so as I started down this path of thinking about what my voice as a artist was, there was this emergence, this synthesis of my civic voice and my artistic voice. And of course, my first book, what became my first book, was this body of work in which I document these empty educational spaces. It was the largely abandoned campus of Morris Brown College at a time when it was in bankruptcy. I'm happy to report that they are on the cusp of being reaccredited. But at the time they were in bankruptcy, and there were these empty spaces, and people are familiar with these education spaces. They speak to us because of their familiarity, and we're used to seeing these hallways, these locker rooms, these classrooms populated by people, not by ghosts. And what I was trying to tell with that body of work is this important narrative in American history, that education is the backbone of the American dream. Mm. And it starts with that commitment to education begins with the first taxpayer-funded school in America in 1644 in Dedham, Massachusetts. And there's this narrative arc that goes from the first taxpayer-funded school to 1862 with the Land Grant College Act, to the historically Black colleges and universities created mostly in the decades after the Civil War, to Rosenwald Schools, to the educational provisions of the GI Bill, to Brown v. Board, to this debate we're having today. How do we deal with college affordability and college access? Mm. And so in finding my way through that project, there was this synthesis of my passion for civic life, the importance of education. And then when I came across the story of the Rosenwald Schools, it was another opportunity, not just to dig into the importance of education, but the importance of this Black-Jewish alliance and the cause of civil rights.
When you talk about being a Southerner and being Jewish and not knowing this story, it makes me think about the things that I didn't learn in school. Mm-hmm. And frankly, some things that I didn't learn around the dinner table at home either. How do we begin to close that gap? Is that part of what you're trying to do in this project?
Well, I think that, look, this is an enormously important story. I think that to really understand how we got to the civil rights movement and where we have been since then, and where we are with education in America today, and that role of education, to really understand the America of today, you have to understand this history. And so I'm bringing this history to light, but it's just one example of hidden history. And I think hidden history to me is history that is often known by one group and not more widely known by other groups. And I think it speaks to this idea that we need to be careful in crafting our curriculum so that it is an inclusive curriculum, so that we have less hidden history and more history that is diverse and shared.
So I want to talk about some of the people that you've mentioned. I mean, how did John Lewis get involved in this project?
So, as you well know, I have lived in Atlanta for 26 years now. I have entirely lived in the 5th Congressional District, so I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis for 25 years. He is the most prominent graduate of a Rosenwald School. And so it was clear to me that he was the ideal person to write this introduction. So I reached out to Congressman Lewis, and he said to me, I'm not really comfortable writing a history of Rosenwald schools. I know I went to school there. And I said to him, I said, Congressman Lewis, I learned about Rosenwald schools from Jeannie Syriac at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and she's written an essay in this book about Rosenwald schools. And I have an essay in this book. And Brent Leggs, who heads up African American preservation at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, has a beautiful afterword in this book. I don't need you to write the history of Rosenwald schools. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. Tell us what it was like to be a student in that school. And talk to us about that thing that you talk so eloquently about how, to use his phrase, education is the cornerstone of democracy. He's like, oh, I can do that. And that's how it evolved.
And that he does.
And that he does.
And that he does very well. Well, tell us about Rosenwald. I mean, to what extent was his philanthropy attached to his faith, to his commitment to America?
So Rosenwald was deeply appreciative that America had offered a haven to the Jewish people. But he saw that haven weakened by America's treatment of its African American citizens. And so he says, I believe in America, but I believe that America cannot go forward if half her people are left behind. And so his motivation is very much rooted in his Jewish identity. In addition to that, he is a member of the congregation of Rabbi Emil Hirsch, who is famously a rabbi who very integrally ties Judaism with progressivism and in the quest for social justice. And so there is no question that Rabbi Hirsch's sense of this linkage between Judaism and social justice and Tikkun Olam and Heal the World is clearly a force shaping Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy.
Well, we've talked about the schools and the contributions that Rosenwald made and the relationship that he had to Booker T. Washington. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that relationship that perhaps you haven't shared?
I think that the importance, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, and this idea of forming this foundation of the Black Jewish coalition, they are change-making partners. First of all, Julius Rosenwald is invited to go on the board of Tuskegee. They meet May 11th. They meet May 18th, 1911. So I say that deliberately because this coming May 18th is the 110th anniversary of their meeting. They have been introduced by mutual friends. Booker T. Washington has an agenda. He wants Julius Rosenwald to come on the board of Tuskegee. And Julius Rosenwald actually agrees to go on the board of Tuskegee, but they keep talking. They like each other. They develop this deep friendship. What else can we do together? And they end up hitting on this idea of small schools across the South. So they have a professional relationship in terms of Tuskegee. They have a civic relationship in the Rosenwald schools, and they have this deep friendship. And I tell that story because we have just seen this in action. As you well know, for 2 months across this state, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff traveled the state together in close partnership. And just like Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, they developed not just a political partnership, but a deep friendship. You can tell it in their interaction together. And Georgia sends a Jewish filmmaker and an African-American pastor to the US Senate together. And I believe that the partnership of John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald.
That gives me chills.
It does.
chills. And it also speaks to how this this planting the seeds and developing these relationships have benefits generations later.
Absolutely. Yes, this is
100 years later, which is really pretty phenomenal.
right.
So as we close this part of the conversation, what does this project mean to you?
This project, I think it's fair to say, became a bit of an obsession. I did drive 25,000 miles. And I did go to 15 of these program states, plus the District of Columbia and New York and Chicago as part of this work. First of all, I'm a better photographer at the end of every project than I am at the beginning of every project. I think a lot of artists would say something like that. I think that my practice has evolved because of this work, because while my process was always to read and shoot and shoot and read, I read 41 books for this project. I read 50 white papers, untold number of newspaper stories. There are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I read 50 of those nomination forms. That's what all the people that I met led me to write these stories. And I think that integration of my inherent interest in history, linking it with my photography, has changed my practice. And I think that my work going forward will be much more immersive in history because of this experience. But I think the heart of the answer to your question is, I came to understand how this enormously important program in our history was one that I was not aware of. I feel like I have a better grounding in this important aspect of American history, of Southern history, of Jewish history, of African American history. And I hope that my future projects will also leave me more informed and better able to take those history lessons and apply them to how we can make positive change today.
It's interesting to me because in my reading the book and going through the book, I found myself both seeing it as a series of short stories and photographs. And you can really choose how you want to go through this history. It's a point of, it gives you an opportunity to look at history through the eyes of others.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you can reflect on your own role. Because when we say these almost 5,000 schools were built, many of them were built with what we would consider meager funds.
Mm-hmm.
And would you speak about that a little bit? I mean, how much money was actually involved in most of these schools, especially in the early years?
So I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think the first school cost $954, and for that particular school, about half the money came from the Black community, about $300. A third of it came from Julius Rosenwald, and actually in that case, the white community put up a portion of it. But in the early days of the program is largely funded by the Black community and by Julius Rosenwald.
Mm.
But over time, and remember, they lay this groundwork by requiring the engagement of this white school board. And over time, the program shifts. And it shifts really for two reasons. It shifts so that, but in the later stages of the program, there is substantially more public funding of these schools. And it shifts for two reasons. One is Julius Rosenwald's contribution has given the white school board political cover, but also because of the Great Migration.
Mm.
Because the South is losing its African American workforce, and it is partially tied to the poor quality of educational infrastructure. And so the school systems decide that the politics become, we need to build better schools to keep our workforce down on the farm, right? And so by the end of the program, Julius Rosenwald has actually only contributed 15% of the funds. The African American communities contributed 27% of the total funding, and 64% of the funding actually comes from public sources. And the small remainder, about 4%, I think, if I'm doing the math right in my head, comes from the white community. But public funds become much more important over time, and that just speaks to kind of the genius of this program that's been created, of how these funds can become the Rosenwald funds can become a magnifier to bring in other funds from both the Black community and the public funding.
And the power of cooperation.
Absolutely.
And the power of cooperation, and also the power of a great idea.
Yeah.
I mean, seizing an idea that other people can contribute to, not just be led by one group or another.
Right.
We're going to see if we have some questions. The first question is, you're bringing this important history to the, my eyes are not as good as they should be, to the forefront. As one of the African-American companies that restored one of the Rosenwald schools in Texas, how do you suggest this crucial information gets shared with children in schools today? They truly need to know the importance of these schools and how they are an integral part of the public education system. And it is an honor to be a part of this history, and very much looking forward to purchasing and viewing and reading your book. God bless. So there's an essential question there of how do we make this crucial information available?
So there's a couple of answers to that question. First of all, as I recall, and I did not order this book, but I actually think there's a children's book on the Rosenwald Schools program. But look, I think a couple of things. First of all, I want to just say thank you to that questioner for his or her role and the team's role in restoring the schools that they have worked on. These efforts to restore these schools are enormously complex and take a lot of effort. And I think they're just hugely important, because the longer we wait, the more likely we are to lose these resources. So I think I applaud those preservation efforts. Part of what I am trying to do with this book is to use photography to bring more people into the story. It is art as a welcoming doorway into these stories. And so I hope that this book will become that easier entree into this essential history. But there is a broader issue here, as we talked about briefly earlier, and that is our curriculum overall needs to be more diverse. We need to be telling essential stories of African American history, of Asian American history, of Jewish American history, of Muslim American history, of LGBTQ history. And so I think therein lies a wonderful opportunity for all of us to be engaged in that process of ensuring our curriculum and the rising generations receive as diverse a history message as possible.
Thank you. We've got a second question. Several people I've asked about the reaction to the schools at the time. Was there opposition in the white community? Were white boards resistant to funding, either the faculty or the schools?
So the reaction to the program varies widely by jurisdiction and varies over time. There are certainly jurisdictions where there are no Rosenwald schools. But I'd say two things. Number one, in many places, these schools were stunningly dense. And I'll give you, one example. Newberry County, South Carolina, had 26 Rosenwald schools in one county. Now, part of the reason for that was, as you see, these are small schools. Black school children were not offered school buses. at a time when larger schools are being built for the white community, which is enabled by school buses, the Black children are still walking to school. So they have this network of smaller schools. There are counties, there's a county in North Carolina that had more than 80 Rosenwald schools. But by the end of this program, 2/3 of all exclude Missouri, because it only had 3 schools that enters the program late. The 14 core states in this program, 2/3 of all counties had Rosenwald schools, and 85% of counties that had African-American school-aged children had Rosenwald schools. So at the end of the program, its reach is rather sweeping.
That is, I mean, almost 5,000 is amazing.
It is.
And this notion that some counties really dug in to say, how can we make this work for us, even if it was to avoid integrating schools.
Right.
Do you think, I mean, you've read a lot about this and a lot of the literature. Do you think the white community actually thought that a James Baldwin and a John Lewis and a Maya Angelou were being educated in these schools?
You know, I mean, there's this, one of the criticisms that gets directed at Julius Rosenwald is that he was funding segregated schools. Well, you can understand the essence of that criticism is that, you know, Julius Rosenwald in 1912 should have been pushing for integration. Well, all you have to do is look at the reaction to the efforts to integrate in the 1950s and realize that one philanthropist in Chicago was not going to change, not going to be able to make that much change. And I think that this narrative speaks to some degree to pragmatism, patience, and a long-term vision, but in particular, optimism. I think that one of the things that always struck me about Congressman Lewis, about all of his experience, is that deep down, he would talk, I mean, he would say, be hopeful, be optimistic. After everything John Lewis had been through, it's at his core, he was an optimist. This story, what Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington shared was a deep optimism in America. And it was a long-term, they were playing long ball. And at some level, you have to appreciate both that optimism and the long ball. And I think that's a reminder to all of us today. Be optimistic, play long ball.
Well, there's no question that they took on, I mean, they didn't do 200 or 300 schools just around. I mean, they were very ambitious and moved from state to state. And there's no question that they had a vision that education would supersede all else that was an obstacle in the lives of children. We have another question. Did you find the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, had a significant impact on the schools? And if so, what was that impact?
Yes, it's an interesting question. It's a very complex answer. So first of all, I have a nomenclature in my titles as I describe the school. So first of all, I have the name of the school, because each school was given a name by its local community. And sometimes it's named after the church that it stood near. Sometimes it's named after the town. Sometimes it's named after civic leaders who helped raise the money for the school. Sometimes it's named after famous citizens. And then I have the county, because the money flowed through the county school systems. And then I have the year that it opened, but also the year that it closed. And the reason I put the closure year is that speaks to that question. The reaction to Brown v. Board varies widely, not just by state, but by individual school jurisdiction. And many of these schools, a number of these schools closed in the 1950s, right after Brown, but many of them are alive until late into the 1960s. Some of those as integrated schools, but most of those are still segregated schools. But here's the other answer to your question. These schools had Black teachers. And when integration took place, a lot of the Black students were often integrated into white schools, and a lot of the Black teachers lost their jobs. And so it was, and I'd say two other things about that. One of the amazing stories, there's a professor at Emory, Vanessa Siddle Walker, who wrote this book called The Lost Education of Horace Tate, that talks about the role of Black teachers in segregated schools. And she talks about two different things that are really important to that Black teacher, Black student relationship. One, they taught equality, and they helped create the expectation of equality and the right to equality. The other thing is that the teacher, we think about Brown v. Board, we think about Thurgood Marshall and his group of lawyers kind of leading the charge at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But the data that they used was gathered by Black teacher associations and funneled up to LDF to help make the case that separate but equal was inherently unequal. And one of those teachers who was very specifically involved in that was Ellie Damer, his portrait you saw earlier in the Bay Springs School. And she and I, when I sat with her and her son for 2 hours inside the school, talking about her history with the school and her family. And she talked about that relationship with the school Teachers Association, and how they were funneling this data to the Legal Defense Fund.
There are lots of stories. Now, there's a very interesting question. In a book of this type, there can be an emphasis on either the history or the photographic art. You talked a lot about the importance of history, the important history. Did you ever find a tension with maintaining the high caliber of the photography? And was the photography ever subservient to the history?
No, the photography was never subservient to the history. I mean, I wanted each image to be able to stand on its own. I wanted each story to be able to stand on their own, and yet I also wanted them to all flow together. But I was very, I spent a lot of time on the photography. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And first of all, I would do all this research, and I would determine, for example, if I because of Google Street View, and some of these places are in rural areas that don't have Street View, but there were times when I would get to all the way down to Google Street View and see, what does the front of the school look like? And is that additive to my narrative? And if it is, how's it oriented in terms of the light? Do I need to get there early in the morning, or do I need to get there late in the afternoon? And so there's this whole aspect of the research about how you shoot these. But I would also, I showed the school earlier, the Denby School in Virginia. And I knew that the way that I was in Washington, I drove down, I had to be back in Washington that night for dinner. It was going to be really harsh light. I knew I needed afternoon light or clouds, and clouds were coming in the afternoon. Well, I get there at 10:30 in the morning. The light is behind the school. It is really harsh. There's no clouds in the sky. And I sit there in my car across the street from this school until 2:30 in the afternoon, and the clouds finally come in, and I'm able to. So, I mean, I was determined that these photographs this started out as a photography project. I wanted the photographs to be as strong as possible, and I believe that they are, and they're not subservient to the stories. At the same time, when I was crafting the stories, I was conscious that I was doing two things. There's what I call the horizontal narrative. From beginning to end, the stories have to tell the entire narrative arc of the Rosenwald Schools program. But they also have the vertical narrative, how that narrative arc relates to this individual photograph. And so that's what I tried to balance. And so in that collective, I think I tried to make each story as strong as they could be, and collectively strong, and each photograph as strong as it could be and collectively strong.
Did you ever think about just picking one or two of the schools and telling the whole story of that community versus going across the country and telling many stories?
At the very, very beginning of this project, when Jeannie Syriac told me that she had found at the time, I think it was 38 Rosenwald schools in Georgia, I actually thought the original project might just be the Rosenwald Schools of Georgia. But as soon as I went to, ventured out of Georgia, and I think my first trips were to South Carolina and North Carolina and Alabama, and you find these amazing schools with start to uncover these amazing stories. It was like, okay, this is 15 states.
We've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. How are there ways to learn about or support Rosenwald schools and their restoration? And do you have any advice for our audience on that?
That's a really good question. First of all, I will tell you that as we speak, there are groups of alumni or civic leaders in these communities that have schools that are not yet restored that are actively engaged in the process of raising money to try to restore these schools. And you can, so how do you get connected to that? I know that the National Trust for Historic Preservation has this African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. It's run by Brent Leggs. It's funded some restorations of Rosenwald schools. It just funded the restoration of the Mars Hill School outside of Asheville. So one is to engage the National Trust. The other, and I don't have a list, and it's an interesting thing. Maybe I'll work on putting together a list. But I know, for example, I know that there's a community in Alabama that's just come together and they're working to restore a Rosenwald School there. I would look for these individual initiatives and work to support those.
So we're getting very specific now. So there's someone called Bruce here, Bruce Feiler, and he has a question. What a wonderful night, he says. That's the setup. And thanks to both of us for our enthusiasm, etc. Andrew mentioned that these images will be opening next month at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Can you tell us more about that show and other ways that the images will be shared around the country?
So, so there will be a museum show of this work. There are 85 photographs in the book. There'll be 28 in the exhibition. It opens at the Center for Civil and Human Rights in downtown Atlanta, May 22nd. It'll be up through December 12th. It will then go to the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. From there, it will go to the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, and I'm in active conversations with a number of other museums. So this exhibition is going to travel for quite a while. The exhibition prints are printed huge. They are 20 by 30, which is a very large photograph. And I can just tell you the images are just magnificent. And even if you spend time with the book, I would really encourage you to come down and enjoy what these prints look like on such large scale. The prints are for sale. As I mentioned, I had the first purchase last night by somebody who lives in a community in Arkansas with a Rosenwald School, which was kind of a joyous moment. And I've had the first inquiry from a museum as to this work going into their permanent collections, which of course for photographers is an important milestone. And it's great to be able to have these opportunities with this work.
That's great. Now we've got one or two more questions. I want to say that I visited the Lorraine Motel, the National Museum, and saw your exhibit there. And it was really a wonderful exhibit, and really the photographs spoke about the hope and optimism of people seeking an education and a better life for themselves.
Yeah, thank you. That Shirley speaking to the exhibition of the work from my first book that also went to the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. And let me just add, I mean, they have the folks at the National Civil Rights Museum have done an incredible job of telling these essential stories, including the assassination of Dr. King. I consider this location to be hallowed ground in America. I think it's a modern day pilgrimage site to America. All Americans should go there. And it's the sign of, it's the location of one of those most essential moments in our history.
So I agree. It is quite a thought-provoking and inspiring trip to visit the National Museum. We've got a couple more questions. How much did I know about Rosenwald Schools before? I knew something about them, but certainly not the stories. I had no idea there were 4,700 schools, and I did not know the history to the depth that is possible in reading this book. And Andrew, did you get any insight into why Rosenwald Schools were not a part of your Jewish awareness?
Yeah, so Julius Rosenwald did not name this program Rosenwald Schools. It became known as Rosenwald Schools. He was actually quite modest. And in fact, he is the principal funder behind the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And they wanted to put his name on it, on the museum, and he refused. But Julius Rosenwald did something that was very innovative for his time. He believed that the people who generated the wealth should benefit from that wealth. So that the customers of Sears who had helped create this wealth, that generation should benefit from his financial success. And so he mandated that all of the money in the Rosenwald Fund should be distributed within 25 years of his death. Now, that has become very fashionable in philanthropy today. Warren Buffett has made a declaration like that. Bill Gates has made a declaration like that. Locally, Bernie Marcus has made a declaration like that. But it was very innovative for its time. And in fact, the Rosenwald Fund expended all the money within 15 years of Julius Rosenwald's death and shut down in 1948. And as laudatory as that is, I think it plays a role in us not knowing this legacy, because Julius Rosenwald is not as well known as some of his philanthropic peers. We know the name Ford and Carnegie and Rockefeller because their names still appear on these active foundations. But I think that plays a role.
Is there a Rosenwald School in close driving distance to Atlanta that some of our participants might visit?
Yeah, the Noble Hill School up in Cassville, Georgia, in Bartow County is about an hour up I-75. It has been turned into a museum that celebrates both the legacy of these schools, but also Black life in North Georgia. And it is curated by the great-great-granddaughter of a man named Webster Wheeler, who actually built the school. His photograph hangs in the school. And I'm sure that they would love to have more guests from Metro Atlanta come experience the school. It's an absolutely beautiful school, and the folks that are involved in it are absolutely lovely.
Well, thank you for that. And then the last question, what did you learn from your research that could help us address racial inequality today? In 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, right. I'm going to keep that at 30,000 feet because I think that the essence of this story is the optimism and the simple fact that individual actions really do matter. And what Julius Rosenwald did mattered. What Booker T. Washington did here mattered. What those Black communities did in raising these funds and caring about education mattered. And I think that we have this belief that change is hard. Well, it is hard, but change is possible. And as I said earlier, John Lewis, says, be hopeful, be optimistic. I think we should retain our optimism, because this story shows that change is possible even when the issue is race. Change is possible in America. We need to stay engaged, and we need to be fighting the good fight. We need to be making good trouble, and we will overcome.
Thank you, Andrew. This has been a great conversation. I'll turn it over to you now.
Shirley, thank you very much. It is an honor, as I said, to share this stage with you. Sheffield, before you close out, this is the opening event, and I just want to say some thank yous, some essential thank yous. There are more people acknowledged in my acknowledgments than I can thank in the couple of minutes that I have right now. But there's a couple of people that I just, in this opening celebration of this book launch. First of all, I first heard of Rosenwald Schools from Jeannie Syriac, as you all know, and so for that I am eternally grateful. But Jeannie has also written this beautiful essay in this book about her encounter with Rosenwald Schools, and for that I'm also very appreciative. Stephanie Deutsch, whose book on the Rosenwald Schools program is one of the keystone volumes of this history, was a beautiful supporter of this project the entire time. many of the ideas, the people, the stories that I tell in this book visually and in prose were ideas that began with Stephanie. Congressman John Lewis, what an extraordinary opportunity to spend time with him in his office, working on this project, doing his portrait. I'm very grateful for his participation. Brent Leggs, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, wrote his afterword is just extraordinary and a wonderful, wonderful compliment to this project. Lisa Baer, my publisher at the University of Georgia Press, has been the consummate partner of this the entire time of this project, and I'm grateful for that support. Aaron Kirk, at the designer at UGA Press, is, as you go through this book, pay attention to some of the small design decisions that had to be made in this project. Aaron's genius is in her details. There are more than 100 people who helped get me into a Rosenwald school, had me into their home to tell me their story of their connection to these schools, allowed me to shoot their portrait. And for each one of those interactions, I am grateful. There are some funders who were essential in helping make this project possible. So I want to specifically thank the Architects Foundation, the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, Lucinda Bunnan and the Lubo Fund, Georgia Power Foundation, Karen and Mark Coolgeorge, and also Susan Kupferberg, Richard Mitchell, and Jeff Levy. My brother Bruce was a companion through this entire project and touched many of the aspects, many of the details of this project, and everything he touched is better for his input. And finally, I just want to thank my wife, Laura Adams. As I came back from each of those journeys, we would talk about the stories that I had come across, the people that I had met, the photographs I had made. We found together the visual narrative of the story, the emotional center of this story. And as you will all see, this book is dedicated to her. Sheffield, back to you.
Well, this was an amazing talk. Thank you both to Mayor Franklin and to you, Andrew. What a great book. And I was just doing a shout out to the University of Georgia Press. For all those 35 to 40 people whose questions we didn't get to, buy the book. And you can buy it at Acapella Books, it's in there. And if you still have questions, you can go find Andrew down on the Beltline sometime and he'll answer your questions. But don't do it until after you've gone and bought the book and then read through it. And then you can go ask him all the questions you want. It's a fabulous night. If you want to see this again, if you have friends who missed this, it's in our archive, along with the talks from Natasha Trethaway we had this year. And Shirley, we had Isabel Wilkerson, Stacey Abrams, we had Claudia Sant and John Meacham. They're all up in our archive. And now Andrew's going to be up in the archive with Mayor Franklin, and go to that. And we've got Jonathan Alter in 2 weeks with his book on Jimmy Carter. And that'll be another great one. So thank you all for being tonight. It was a great evening. And your point about the chills, it was earlier, it gave me chills as well. There's so many points in this book that just cross and bring everything down to today. Thank you both. And good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shirley.
Thank you.